The last time we spent a really decent amount of GDP on defence was during the Cold War. This isn't a Cold War, it is very much a hot war that we're seeing happening.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines.
I've made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
In this episode of Battle Lines, we look at the UK's new Labour government and its defence policy. Are Keir Starmer and his team up to the job of keeping Britain safe? We also pop over to the NATO summit and ask, how can you Trump-proof the alliance? Plus, we'll examine the fallout from the shock French election result. It's Friday, 12th of July, 2024. We begin here in the UK, where a general election last week saw Labour win a landslide victory. Given the huge number of international conflicts and geopolitical tensions the party will have to deal with in the coming years, I asked our defence editor, Danielle Sheridan, if she thinks it's up to the job. She joined me in the Telegraph studio fresh from a briefing with the new Defence Minister.
Thanks so much for joining us in the studio, Danielle. Where have you just come from?
Thanks for having me. Yes, I have just come off of a briefing with John Healey, the new Defence Secretary. I'm so used to calling him Shadow Defence Secretary, so that might get a bit of getting used to. But he held a briefing with reporters from Washington. He's at NATO's 75th anniversary, and it's a massive deal for him. It's his first kind of big outing with NATO members on the international stage. He will be meeting with Keir Starmer, with hugely important figures in the defence realm, and it actually comes off the back of him going to Ukraine, which he made as his first visit since taking up defence, since becoming the Defence Secretary. So when he came on line to speak to reporters, he did say, my feet have barely touched the ground, and it has been a constant kind of on the go for him, but it shows how seriously he's taking his brief. It also shows how seriously he is taking the war in Ukraine. That, as I understand it, was straight after his first cabinet meeting. He was on a flight where he met with President Zelensky and promised that under this new government, Ukraine would have the UK's unwavering support. So that was really positive to see.
Did you expect that? Because last time we spoke to you, we were talking about the Tories' defence policies and what was in their manifesto, and you said that what Labour had sketched out so far was quite vague. How is it sort of measured up now that they're actually in power in terms of what you've seen, concrete actions, vows, pledges?
In terms of Labour's support for Ukraine, I never doubted that. They have always supported the government. It is the kind of one area that there's been cross-house agreement. So seeing John Healey make his first visit, one that included President Zelensky, wasn't a surprise at all. I think that's brilliant. And Keir Starmer in Washington is making the case for other nations to start increasing their defence spending. 2% of GDP is the target, and he wants to see other NATO nations get to that moment. So in terms of Labour's support for Ukraine, I'm not surprised. When we last spoke, I did say that their detail was scant on defence. And to be honest, it still is. Our front page story today is about the fact that Labour are going to have a strategic defence review, which is going to set out, most importantly, a roadmap of how Labour gets to 2.5%. The Tories have been critical of this. Rishi Sunak pledged to get to 2.5% by 2030. When I spoke to Labour sources yesterday, said, OK, that's all well and good to pluck a figure out of thin air, but they weren't able to detail how they would have the money to get to that. We want to be economically sound and say we will get to this figure as the fiscal opportunity allows, and we will see that year on year, and this is how we're going to get there. So they're being very cagey, and I think it's fair that they want to be economically responsible with how they achieve 2.5%. But the counter argument to that is we do have a huge war in Europe. Russia is becoming increasingly aggressive. We know that there will be trouble in the Indo-Pacific in the near future. Do we have time to say, as the economy allows, we're going to reach this really critical figure? 2.5% of GDP on defence spend is still quite low. There's an argument that it should be 3% minimum. So there's a lot of interest around how we're going to get to that figure. But as I said, right now, the detail is scant. We're all being kept on tender hooks until next week when this review is launched. So as I said, it's going to talk about how the government is going to get to 2.5%, but it's also going to look at other areas in defence which are more domestic and more day-to-day. They're going to be focusing on procurement, has been, incredibly wasteful in the MOD. It's always been an area of contention, but particularly under the Tory government. If you ever sat through a public affairs committee, it was excruciating to hear how they tore apart the defence budget and how many millions of taxpayers' money had been wasted on projects that never saw the light of day. So that's something that Labour really want to crack down on, is how to make the Ministry of Defence's procurement model more effective, particularly to the taxpayer. But that's less sexy, talking about procurement.
I just want to drill into that 2.5% figure, because I looked up the latest NATO defence expenditure as a share of GDP, and there's only 5-6 countries that meet that 2.5, if that was the sort of revised figure, and they will be talking at the NATO summit about whether they should be pushing up that 2. And interestingly, they're all mostly countries that are very close to Russia: Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland. These are countries that are right on the front line of what we see as an increasing threat in Europe. And I think there is an argument that those countries see that it is an immediate threat and they need to do something about it. And because we're geographically further removed, we feel like there's more time. But I can see from a lot of the articles that we've been publishing today and comment pieces that a lot of people in the armed forces don't agree with that assessment.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's the question of geography. The closer you are to the threat, the more you see the threat, the more you know that it's a viable possibility. And many of those countries know what it's like to have been part of the Soviet Empire. Estonia, for example, when I last interviewed Kaja Kallas, the former Prime Minister of Estonia, she grew up in a Soviet world. She knew what it was like to be basically under Russia's shadow. And to her, knowing that is what life has once been, the possibility that it could happen again, it is very probable to her, and that is why she has been so vocal about the need to invest in defence. And the same goes for, as you said, Poland, Latvia. These are countries that know that this threat is real and therefore we need to defend against it. It's interesting because obviously we are quite removed in a geographical sense. I was in Ukraine recently, and it takes me, albeit there are no flights, it took me over 48 hours to get to Kyiv from London. By no means are we close to what's going on, but whilst from a very kind of basic perspective, it is about geography, and those that are closer do recognise the threat. We are further removed and we see the issue. But lots of people say that we don't see it enough by only doing 2.5%. And maybe, who knows what this roadmap to getting to 2.5% is going to be for Keir Starmer. Everyone's got 2030 in their minds because that's the figure that Rishi Sunak pledged to get to, the year that Rishi Sunak pledged to get to. But what happens if Keir Starmer says, oh, by 2035, we're going to get to 2.5%? I think there'll be a lot of anger and people will say that's just not acceptable because the threat is here. We need to be getting there sooner. Saying that, he could even say within 3 years we can be at 2.5%. I think people would be happy. But I also think people think that 2.5% really isn't enough. I don't have the figure off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure the last time we spent a really decent amount of GDP on defence was during the Cold War. This isn't a Cold War. It is very much a hot war that we're seeing happening. And because we aren't directly involved in the fighting, we see ourselves as being somewhat removed. But ultimately, we all are playing a part in this war. We're supporting Ukraine actively. We're sending them artillery. We are training their soldiers. They are fighting this war on behalf of all of us. And if it doesn't go their way, then we will all pay the price. So investing now in defence seems to me like a very sensible decision to make if we want to live in a peaceful a world can be, future.
What else did you glean from your presser with John Healey?
It was really interesting to talk to him because he said that he spoke to the point that Trump might be president. As we know, Keir Starmer, while he's in Washington, has no plans to meet with Trump, but who knows what's going to happen with the American election. Trump's comments about Ukraine have been concerning. He has described NATO as being a bit of a non-entity, and he doesn't think it's a worthwhile alliance, which obviously the majority of the world would argue against that sentiment. But with that in mind, and the potential new presidency, as with the potential new presidency's opinion on NATO, Britain is actively taking a leading role in the alliance. So it wants to be seen as the country that is achieving the target and hopefully more that has been set out by NATO. It wants to encourage other nations to level up and start spending more on defence spending. And I think that Keir will take an active role in being more outspoken on areas of defence as he continues his premiership, and will take a particular interest in how he can work with other nations to get them spending more on defence. Some might say it's a bit rich because the UK is only spending 2%, but at least that is the target. And as part of this defence review, we were given kind of brief notes on it, and I obviously spoke to some of my Labour sources, and they said that a real key part of this review is how the UK can work with its alliances, how it can do more joined up thinking in order to be stronger, which is interesting in itself. And I'd also point to the fact that this review, I've been covering defence since 2020, and I've already covered 2 strategic defence reviews. And so now we have another government. Obviously, they want to put their stamp on it. And it was interesting. Professor John Bew previously worked on the other reviews. He was brought in by the Conservative government. He's no longer with them because they think he's worked too closely with the former government. So they do want their own people working on it. That will be interesting in itself, and the details of it, of which I don't have, but who is brought in charged with looking at this review will be incredibly interesting. But one crucial point they made was that they want to have it published within the year. So, we will know sooner rather than later what the big changes to defence are going to be and how it's going to have, an enlightened attitude, perhaps you could say, to defence going forwards.
There's probably a general opinion that the Tories are the party of defence, seen as stronger on that sort of issue, and that Labour is weaker on that. And one of the questions we've been asking readers at the Telegraph today is, can Labour be trusted on defence? How much do you think that will hamper them going forward? Is it even a fair question to be asking?
I think it's absolutely fair to ask that. I think that is what's so brilliant about democracy, is that we can ask tough questions of our government. We can challenge them. We absolutely don't have to take what they say at face value. We can drill into it. We can figure out if it's correct what they're saying, if there are legs to what they're saying, if it's genuine. And that is what makes the UK so brilliant, that we get that opportunity. And so it's great to hear that readers are engaging and asking these tough questions and not just reading the headlines and going away saying, okay, the issue's sorted then, that's what they've said, so that's what's going to happen. Of course, we know that's not how governments work. But what I would say is, we've had this Prime Minister for not even a week yet. Actions speak louder than words. Our job as journalists is to hold them account. If we are told that within the year we are going to have an answer as to when this 2.5% is going to be implemented, then Labour should know that us journalists will be expecting that. And if not, we'll be having them answer very difficult questions, because you can't just filibuster your way out of this. It's important to put your money where your mouth is.
So we've spoken a lot about the big headline issues, defence spending, Ukraine, but there are a lot of smaller issues that I know you write a lot about as well, and one of them is care of veterans. It took the Labour government quite a while to appoint a veterans minister, and they came under some fire for that, didn't they? Why is it important, and why do you think it took a while?
I don't know exactly what Sir Keir was umming and ahhing about. He knew it was a really important position to fill. He was being openly criticised by Johnny Mercer, the former Veterans Minister, and the longer he took to announce who was going to take this role, it's Alistair Cairns, by the way, who's now the Veterans Minister, the longer he took to announce who was going to fulfil the role, the more opportunity it was for people to criticise him. And it was painful to watch, because the answer was so easy: announce the appointment and we can move on from this. But it allowed a whole kind of diatribe to exist about about he doesn't care about veterans. They try to fudge it by saying that John Healey really believes in veterans, therefore he wants to assume it under his portfolio, and when he goes into cabinet he's going to be representing veterans around the front table. Now, Johnny Mercer attended cabinet. The new Veterans Minister will not attend cabinet, and that in itself is quite interesting because, as I was writing, voices on the other side were saying John Healey has a lot on his plate. How's he also going to remember to talk about veterans when he's got the war in Ukraine, for example, going on? And I also spoke to Lord Dannett, one of the former heads of the army, and he made the very important point that the Ministry of Defence doesn't actually deal with veterans. It's the education department re-educating veterans once they've left service, or the transport department getting them reduced travel fares, or the pensions department. It doesn't actually come into the MOD all that much, and that's why it helps having an independent veterans minister attend cabinet, because they are across all of the issues that affect veterans, and they can go in and single-handedly speak on their behalf. So I don't really understand what the thinking is to remove the Veterans Minister from cabinet unless it is genuine that John Healey believes it's such an important part of his portfolio that he wants to speak for them at the table. As an outsider looking at it, it would have made sense to bring someone else in that could just deal with that one thing so that you don't have to focus on it. But anyway, the Veterans Minister has been appointed now, so we're just going to have to see how that goes. And Dannett did say he really hopes the government reverses its decision and does invite the Veterans Minister into the room. So who knows, maybe something might change. But as it stands, they will definitely be sitting on the sidelines as it.
And one final question, I guess, is there anything else that our listeners should be watching for in terms of Labour on defence, areas that you think people might have missed otherwise?
I think it'll be really interesting to see how they deal with personnel. A lot of stories I wrote earlier this year were about the fact that the armed forces are basically hemorrhaging personnel. They can't seem to offer a desirable contract to keep people in place, and figures are dwindling among all three forces. So something needs to be done to entice people to come into the military in order to see it as a desirable career and one that they want to stick at. I know that the previous government was working on how they can retain people. They were looking at a kind of a zigzagging portfolio where people could leave the military, go into civilian work, get more experience there, return to the military. Whether or not that's something that will continue under Labour will be interesting to see. And then also how they can improve the overall package for service personnel. So I have written a lot about appalling accommodation. Pay isn't great. Being sent away from home for such long periods of time isn't conducive to happy family lives. So what they are going to work on to make it just a better place overall, because this whole conversation has been about the importance of defence. Well, we've spoken a lot about money, but ultimately, what is defence of the realm if you don't have the people to defend it? So that needs to be a key priority, and I'm really interested to see how they manage those difficulties going forward.
Thanks so much.
Now to the US, where the 75th annual NATO summit has been underway this week. Joe Barnes is normally our Brussels correspondent, but he's been stateside reporting on Keir Starmer's first big international engagement. Thanks for joining us, Joe. You've been at the NATO summit this week over in America. What's been going on so far? What have the big themes been in terms of what people are talking about and trying to solve?
So I think the two grand issues have been Ukraine, the ongoing war of repelling Russia's invasion, and then the other is China. I'll start with Ukraine. Ukraine wanted and still wants a invite to join NATO. It sees NATO's Article 5 guarantee, the mutual defence clause, as basically the ultimate deterrence for deterring any future Russian aggression and ending the war, essentially. NATO allies aren't keen to do that. For various reasons, they don't want to issue an invite to a country while it's at war and there's a border dispute. They see it as escalatory in the eyes of Moscow, and they also don't think Ukraine is ready. There's things like anti-corruption reforms, quality of its armed forces, the really nerdy things like civilian control over the armed forces. There's still sort of lots of reforms to do and carry out before it becomes a reality. But what happened, quite interestingly. The text was actually agreed on Ukraine very quickly, with ease, and actually without a row. So if you look back to the last NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, last year, President Zelensky, even before he arrived, tweeted on Telegram messages, wrote that NATO was absurd because NATO allies basically refused to offer an invitation. So the Americans have been working really hard to find a way to placate the Ukrainians while giving the likes of Britain, the Eastern Europeans, NATO, Ukraine's NATO allies in Europe, enough to be comfortable that they're not letting Ukraine down either. So the wording promises that sort of as Ukraine continues this vital work, we will continue to support it on its irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership. We reaffirm that we will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. And they basically say, look, we are putting together a bridge for Ukraine to NATO membership. So yeah, interesting. So before I travelled to the summit in Washington, Tony Diver, our US editor, and I wrote a story about how there was a row between the UK and US and other sort of allies in favour of putting the word irreversible into the statement. So actually, Keir Starmer lands in Washington and secures an early diplomatic victory. This was a position carried over from Rishi Sunak's government, but the British delegation were quite chuffed with themselves. I was speaking to a few of my contacts in there, and they were happy that they got the word irreversible in. So, yeah, big win for the Brits. But in terms of concrete support, the Ukrainians have been promised more air defence. There is a meeting, so it's Thursday as I speak to you today. There's a meeting later on where Zelensky is going to speak to and address the NATO 32 as part of what's known as the NATO Ukraine Council. So it's his opportunity to speak to leaders and address them. I expect more promises of air defence, other sort of military donations, and there is apparently going to be some sort of moment where they get together all the countries. So it's about just over 20 now that have signed bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, and they're going to put some sort of umbrella statement over the top of those, basically bring them all in one mini agreement that basically shows how much resolve the West has for supporting Ukraine.
And then what about China? You mentioned also been a big theme. We haven't been hearing as much about China, particularly here in the UK during the election period, but of course it remains a massive geopolitical threat probably in the next decade.
Yeah, so China, again, interesting. And the G7 recently issued really harsh words on China, basically accusing it of being an enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. But NATO's always shied away from really coming out strong in this terms, but it's followed suit. And the statement that the NATO 32 issued was accused China of being a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. It said that the No Limits Partnership and the large support for Russia's defense industrial base increases the threat that Russia poses to neighbors and Euro-Atlantic security. So yeah, actually, like in diplomatic parlance, this is NATO coming out swinging. They're really strong on this. It's in reality, it's just a sort of a stern finger wag that I guess anyone can say China aren't going to listen to that, but they're basically saying, look, we know what you're doing. You might not be supplying weapons to Ukraine, to Russia. So you might not be supplying weapons to Russia, but we know that you are doing things to prop up its economy and sending it civilian components that ultimately are being used to produce things like missiles and repair tanks and stuff like that. So yeah, that was a big moment. And it's interesting because, again, it's one thing, the US, Donald Trump especially, is really interested in China and making sure that the Indo-Pacific region of the world is secure. So actually coming out swinging, calling out China, basically putting China on everyone's thoughts is a bit of Trump-proofing for the alliance. It's an interesting move.
Yeah, and that's something I wanted to ask you about, actually. Just finally, how do you Trump-proof NATO? We've seen lots of stories now, and of course he's not in power yet, and it's not a certain thing that he's going to win the election, but it is looking very likely. And we've seen stories already about people within his camp briefing that they might share less security with their European partners. And there's just a lot of consternation in general, isn't there, that Trump will not be as committed to NATO as the US has been under Biden. How do you Trump-proof NATO?
Yeah, so there's been, as you say, lots of stories. I think one doing the rounds today is that the US would share less intelligence with its European allies, which would be bad news because ultimately the US is seen as having the best intelligence network in the world. Obviously, everyone will debate that, but largely it has a lot of intelligence and it shares it with its European allies quite a lot. So yeah, that would be a massive blow. But first of all, they brought in Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister. He is going to be the next Secretary General. And he has a history of standing up to Donald Trump because, for various reasons, during sort of battles between the EU and the US on trade, Mark Rutte was happy to stand next to Donald Trump and call him out on sort of false accusations and mistruths that Donald Trump would often say on the podium or when speaking in press conferences, etc. So that's the first step. Then the next step is actually Trump-proofing assistance for Ukraine, and that's been a big part of this. People inside NATO would always say, I think Jens Stoltenberg actually used the words protecting support for Ukraine against the changes in the winds of political change, but that was always known as Trump-proofing. So today they're going to agree to a continued level of support for Ukraine, 40 billion euros for next year, and hopefully they're going to be able to roll that over every year as some multi-annual agreement eventually. But a lot of it is all about showing Donald Trump that Europe is doing more. So there'll be a big play on the number of people spending 2% of GDP on defence spending. When that target was formed in 2014 in Wales and in Newport at Summit, I think only 2 or 3 NATO members hit that target. Then it went up to 11, then 14, and then as of today, we believe it to be about 23 of the 32 allies. So they're going to celebrate that. They're going to show that Europe is burden sharing, as they like to say. They're sharing the burden of protecting Europe and the Euro-Atlantic area. And then eventually they're going to ratchet up language and look at, do we have to set a target of 3% of GDP on defence spending? Is it going to be higher? How do we basically make sure that the Europeans are doing their part to protect Europe and not just relying on American defence spending? So that is basically how you Trump-proof in the eyes of NATO officials and NATO diplomats and diplomats from national delegations working on alliance matters. That's how you do it.
Finally to France, where the second round of elections last week delivered a shock victory for the left. I caught up with our Europe editor, James Crisp, to find out more.
Can you start by catching our listeners up with the French elections? Last they heard, Marine Le Pen didn't win, as she was hoping she might, and instead the victory went to the left coalition. What's happened since Sunday?
As you can expect, it was quite a shock on Sunday. Marine Le Pen was meant to win, was expected to win. As it turned out, French voters came out in force to make sure that the hard right were kept away from the gates of power for the first time since the Second World War. That doesn't mean that the situation has been resolved or things get any easier or simpler. Quite the opposite, in fact. What we have is an uneasy alliance of left-wing parties. Now, this is not only an uneasy but extremely broad alliance. So you have the hard left, France Unbowed, a kind of not particularly happy with NATO, not particularly fond of the EU. Imagine kind of Corbyn, but more left-wing than Corbyn. Not a huge fan of Israel, quite soft on Hamas, quite soft on Putin, not a great friend to the Jewish community. Then you have the centre-left Socialist Party. One of their most prominent members, a guy called Glucksmann, someone who's being tipped to perhaps emerge as a future president, is in fact Jewish and has been a victim of anti-Semitic abuse, not from the Vichyist National Rally, but from the left. Nevertheless, they've managed to patch over their kind of difficulties in order to unite against this common enemy. And they're in this front with communists, with Greens. It's kind of a ragtag bunch, basically. Now, okay, so you have this big group. They're in first place. Then in second place, you have Emmanuel Macron's sort of presidential camp Ensemble. They lost about 100 seats. So they're weakened, but they're not as weakened as they were predicted to be. Then you've got National Rally, who underperformed very badly, but remain the single largest single party. If it was just parties versus parties, they would be the biggest. So they shouldn't be discounted. Marine Le Pen is already crafting the narrative that this election was stolen from National Rally by an unholy alliance between the left and Macron. And as we've sort of seen in other countries around the world, those kind of, bonkers myth making does sort of tend to work. There's nothing the right loves more than a stab in the back myth. That's well underway at the moment. So cause for pessimism in the future, and 2027's presidential election, and we might still have a President Le Pen heading up the Elysee. But in the meantime, what we have is no party or alliance of parties having enough to have a majority. So we're left with deadlock. We're left with uncertainty. We're left with Macron hoping that maybe he might be able to split off the sort of more traditional kind of Labour-style socialists from Mélenchon and his France Unbowed party, cobble together some kind of working majority, even if it's on a case-by-case basis. But that won't be easy, right? Because even the centre-left campaigned on a promise for a total break with Macron and his highly controversial reforms, this evil plan he has of raising the retirement age in France from 60 to 64.
Yeah, it pales in comparison to what we have here. Yeah.
But yeah, joking aside, basically this means it's going to be very hard to get anything done in France. Now, Macron retains powers in defense and foreign policy. He's still able to go to NATO in Washington and play the globe-trotting president. He'll probably be welcomed in NATO. He'll probably be congratulated for having seen off the threat of the hard right. He'll probably be being asked by people like Joe Biden, how exactly do I stop populist right-wing leaders from grabbing power? The fact is it's left France looking pretty ungovernable. And while, yes, foreign policy, stuff like Ukraine remains in the president's purview, in reality, he can't just do whatever he wants without involving Parliament.
So let's zoom in on NATO and Ukraine a bit. Obviously, Ukraine will be the main issue on the agenda at the NATO summit, which is taking place as we speak and will be finished by the time our listeners hear this. How much scope will Macron have for continuing to provide the support that Ukraine desperately needs?
Well, I think the fact is he's weakened, right? He will be able to talk a good game. A lot of people, especially in the EU, and even more specifically in Berlin, have long accused Macron of talking a good game when it comes to sending weapons and aid to Ukraine, and then not quite following it up in reality. It's not nothing, right? French support for EU initiatives to continue sending a lot of aid and weapons to Ukraine will be important. I think the fact is that you'd be looking more at Germany, you'd be looking again, even at Britain and other countries to really be driving that forward. Whatever people say about how French foreign policy won't be affected by the parliamentary deadlock, the fact is, if you are suddenly a lame duck president for the first time in your career, and you've got 3 years left of your term, and you've staked almost all your political capital on reforms which now won't get through, and the rest of your political capital on defeating the hard right in an election you never had to call in the first place, you might be slightly distracted from what's going on in Kyiv, no matter how much you want to introduce strategic ambiguity by suggesting you might use France's nuclear arsenal to defend Europe. I think the road is running out, really, for Macron. I don't think he should ever be underestimated. He's clearly a very clever man. I think he's not clever enough to hide how clever he thinks he is, but he is a clever man. Don't underestimate him, but he's got a lot on his plate at the moment.
Finally, I wanted to ask about Gaza and Israel. I know some of the left-wing parties in France promised that they would campaign for Palestine to be recognised as a state. Will this become a live issue, or is it likely to get lost in the myriad of other issues that French Parliament will be facing?
I think it is a live issue already domestically within the new Popular Front coalition. believe that their program says that they will go for immediate recognition of the state of Palestine, but they don't have a majority. So until they can get a majority, it's kind of irrelevant.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.